Welcome back to the Puma Podcast. I'm Tory.
Hey, I'm Puma.
And what do we do on this podcast, Puma?
We talk about Jesus, life, and everything in between.
Bam. There it is.
There it is, yeah. It's been an eventful summer. It's going by super, super fast.
Yes.
You know, we both got sick coming out of camp. So we're still a little
congested, a little bit nasally, but it's okay. If I'm going to get sick, let it be doing what God wants me to do.
Yeah, and let's get sick together.
Yeah. Safety in numbers?
Yeah, safety in numbers.
Yeah. Summer is just a very unique time for ministry, I think, especially youth ministry. But it's just very cool that despite the crazy, the busy, the whatever, God still has an agenda. God still is in control. Is very much invested in our lives, and even in this, series, the God of the Old Testament.
Right. Well, God is who He is. He's never changed. I mean,
right.
Bible. We've talked about this in previous podcasts. That God is a God who doesn't change, and sort of the theme verse that we've been looking at from Exodus, 34, that God is gracious and compassionate. It's when God reveals to Moses and tells Moses what he is like, his character. And I mean, God tells us what he's like throughout the whole Bible. I mean, every time he does something, he's telling us something about himself. He tells us about his acts, his mighty works, and everything else. But when he says to Moses, I am a gracious and a compassionate God, I am slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, forgiving sin, rebellion, and wickedness, but I don't leave the guilty unpunished. If someone is truly guilty, I will punish them.
Yeah, he's just.
And you see that's the heart of God. And we had looked at Jonah, a few weeks ago.
A little bit ago.
And in Jonah, I mean, that's the whole point. Why Jonah didn't want to go to the Ninevites. One, because he hated them. But two, he knew that this is who God is, and that God always does what God does. He always is who he is. In other words, there can be incredible confidence and trust in God to be God in every situation. Even this summer, with all the things going on, all the craziness, and I mean, we had a house fire a couple weeks ago.
During like a derecho wind lightning storm.
It just lightning hit our power line, ripped it off the side of our house. In torrential rains, literally the side of our house was on fire in flames.
Right. Can't be indoors because of the smoke. Can't be outdoors because of the storm.
Yeah, it was a little comical. Go downstairs, tornado. Go outside because of fire. Go inside because lightning.
Yeah, and yet still, right? I mean, just the mercy of God that He was right there with us, literally in the storm and the fire, and we were safe. And God provided, and is still. There's always details and stuff, but God was still very much with us and protected us, which is just amazing.
Yeah. And God is not just who he is today, but as we want to look at in the Old Testament, one of the characteristics and the caricatures that people have of God in the Old Testament is that he is just selfish and mean and vindictive. And one of those comes from when he tells the people of Israel, to go into the promised land. God gave them the promised land because he promised it to them. Right. But he says, when you go in, I want you to destroy the nations that are there in killing the men, women, and children.
Yeah, right. And I think that's a great point. I hear all the time from my teens. I mean, all the time might be a stretch, but I hear often from young people. It's
an easy argument to make from afar in order to justify why I don't need to follow or trust God.
Right, yeah. God killed babies. Yeah. God killed innocent women. Right, the men might have deserved it when God brought destruction in the Old Testament, but the women, the children, that's an unjust God. That's an evil God. We're going to talk about that today. Is God unjust? Like, we know he's not, but then why would he command? Not even, hey, if you want to, but he commanded you will kill everybody, including the babies, including the women. That is a hard truth, but the Bible has a lot to say about that, of what it looks like for a holy and merciful God to, quote, kill, and I say this in quotes, innocent people.
Right, and even saying that God killed people.
Right, you're misunderstanding.
God is the ultimate cause of all things, but often we make God the cause of our issues. Right? Is there any innocent person on the planet that is innocent before holy God? No.
Right.
Does anyone deserve life? No. So any life that anyone has is really because God is being gracious and merciful. not because we're deserving. But that's not the typical mindset. We don't think about that. But anyway, let's jump into this.
Yeah, let's dive into this. Hopefully if you feel a little uncomfortable, that's good. Because if you know the heart of God, this is not his heart.
Right. And I will say that it's not like Tory and I are super comfortable with this either.
Right.
Yeah, it's not like, people died. Yeah. No, it is hard. Mm-hmm. But this is, again, why one of the things I think really gives credibility to the Bible. Mm-hmm. It doesn't shy away from hard things.
That's a good point.
God, the Bible deals with reality so that we can live in reality because, if you're not dealing in reality, you're in deep, deep trouble.
Yeah, agreed.
So,
yeah, well, let's dive into this topic of God and his justice. All right, Puma, here we are. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, well, so, they're on the east side of the Jordan River. The whole nation, Moses has, passed away and everyone, and now they're ready to cross the Jordan River and enter the promised land. And the very first city is the city of Jericho. Jericho. Right? Many of our listeners might be familiar with the story of Jericho, where God tells them to march around the city, and for several days. On the last day, march around it 7 times, and then the walls cave in.
Came a crumbling down.
Yeah,
there's a song to that, right?
Yeah, and then they were supposed to go in and basically destroy the city and kill men, women, children, and animals. Kill them all. Right?
Complete decimation.
Yeah. So why would God say that?
Yeah.
Why would God command them to do that?
And this is like the first. Like this is how he starts the promised land entry with Joshua.
Yeah. And so I think it's helpful to just be familiar with some of the verses
let's go
that kind of do that. Do you want to go to Genesis 15?
Yeah, right there.
We had mentioned this in a previous podcast briefly, but this is Genesis 15. This is actually, probably 450, 500 years, maybe not quite 500 years earlier. So, Tory, why don't you go ahead and read Genesis 15? This is hundreds of years earlier that God says this to Abraham.
Yeah, so Genesis 15:16, God says this to Abraham. Then in the 4th generation, they will return here in the promised land, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
Yeah, when God is talking to Abraham, or, he's basically telling him that he's going to have, descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. God makes a promise to him that the land that he sees from the north, south, east, and west, God promises this land to Abraham's descendants. And there are people, though, that live in the land. Right? The people that live in the land. And the people that live in the land don't know Yahweh. In fact, they do all kinds of detestable things. And what's crazy is like Sodom and Gomorrah, right?
Yeah.
In the time of Abraham. Sodom and Gomorrah were 2 cities in the south there in Israel today. Sodom and Gomorrah were not anomalies. Sodom and Gomorrah were the norm.
That's crazy.
In other words, the whole land deserved that. The whole land deserved the punishment and judgment of God. They weren't like, it's not like all the rest of the people in the land were spotless and clean and moral. They were
every city. Was
they were wicked people. Their worship and their practices. I mean, we honestly, Tori and I were talking about this earlier this week. There are a lot of things that happened that we actually can't say in a podcast because they are so graphic.
Yeah,
I mean,
so evil.
Yeah,
twisted.
the types of things that were done in their worship and the practice, and just how the abuse of humanity and abuse of each other and people and men and women, and the abuse of children that went on in the land. And so when we read, like in Leviticus 18, where God says, to them, I want you to go in and I want you to do this. And then Leviticus 18 lists all kinds of evil practices. And then God says, this is how they lived in Egypt, and this is how the people in the land of Canaan that you're going lived. Do not do what they do, because their evil and wickedness is so bad that I'm gonna vomit them out of the land. I mean, they deserve. The whole culture is so decayed, they deserve judgment. Yeah. But this is 400 plus years earlier that God says this to Abraham, that the sin of the land and this is the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, has not yet reached its full amount.
Yeah, it's not complete yet.
Yeah. I mean, in other words, when God says to Moses that I'm gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness.
Right.
The people of the land deserved to be wiped out justly by God, by divine judgment by God in the time of Abraham.
Right. Well, even verse 13 in Genesis 15, it says, God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the land, and it will not be theirs. They will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years, right? 400 years.
Yeah.
But I will also judge the nation whom they serve, and afterwards will bring them out with many possessions. As for you, you should go in peace with your father. And then verse 16, then in their fourth generation, they will return here, for their sins for the sins of the Amorites is not yet complete.
Yeah.
So he's predicting 400 years of sin and
400 years of multiplied sin.
Yeah.
Sin doesn't get less, and we know this just in human nature, right? I mean, if people are left to do whatever they want to do they get more moral and righteous? No. People get more and more wicked and perverse. In fact, mankind is really good at becoming more, more sinful and inventing ways to sin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just so. Part of God's not just giving the land to his people that he promised Abraham, his descendants would live there, but it's also part of his divine judgment. In Deuteronomy, he says, "Hear, O Israel, you're about to cross the Jordan to dispossess the nations that are stronger than you." Okay, right? He says that these people are stronger than you. Right? He said, "Be assured today that the Lord your God is the one who goes ahead and crosses before you like a devouring fire. He will destroy them. He will subdue them before you, and you will drive them out and annihilate them quickly, as the Lord has promised you. And after the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you." In other words, the people of the land were not innocent. They were guilty. And so the whole culture was guilty. And so God said, I want you to go in and I want you to wipe them out. Yeah. And this is part of God's divine judgment.
Right.
And I think it's important to note too that God didn't tell Israel, be colonists and go take over the world. He said, I'm giving you this land. There's limits to it. In fact, there was only like 10 people groups that lived in the land that he said you need to annihilate completely. He said, don't go in and kill everybody and everywhere you see because you're God's people. I mean, that's not what God's saying.
Right.
So there was a limit, and this was a moral issue of right and wrong in divine judgment.
But I think it's important to note, too, that, again, with the story of Jericho, God gave them a chance to repent. Rahab, it wasn't just, 400 years later, I've been patient for 400 years, and so, you know what? My patience run out. You're doomed. There's no hope for you. Even Rahab had the option 400 years later to repent and believe and trust the Yahweh of Israel.
Yeah, it had 400 years, and then had another 40, right? So everyone in the known world at the time, heard what happened to Egypt. Egypt was a superpower, right? Yeah. And they heard, so the plagues lasted for about a year, right? So the whole world's like, oh yeah, what's happening to the superpower Egypt? Oh yeah, the god of these ragtag group annihilated them, destroyed them, Pharaoh and his army and everybody. Basically wrecked Egypt, brought Egypt to its knees, divine judgment. And now this horde of people is headed toward Canaan, toward this, what we call the promised land, right? Well, and God, we know that God, because of the people's Israel's sin, ended up in the wilderness for 40 years. But that didn't mean that they weren't multiplying. That doesn't mean that they weren't, that God wasn't working in them. And so for another 40 years, the people in the land of Canaan had an opportunity to repent.
Wow.
Listen to what Rahab says in Joshua 2. It says, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea. That was 40 years earlier.
Yeah, wow.
Right? For you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God, Yahweh your God, is the God of heaven above and on the earth below. You see, God was making himself known one last time to the people in Canaan. And Rahab had a repentant heart.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so God spared her life. See, this, again, like we talked about with Jonah, God is not a God who is just this heartless, vindictive, I'm just going to kill people without cause or just kind of do whatever I want to do.
Yeah.
No, he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, forgiving sin, wickedness, and rebellion, but does not leave the guilty unpunished. But his heart longs to forgive repentant sinners.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Even those that have been just vile and perverse for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And this really gives hope to the United States, honestly.
Yeah,
if we would if we as a culture, because we as a culture deserve God's divine judgment because of cultural sins, but we also, as a culture and as individuals, so Rahab's culture got destroyed, but she herself got saved, because she trusted in Yahweh and did not bend.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, how slow is God in anger?
Right.
Apparently, again, complete debauchery, making Hitler look good for 440 years. We would okay, God, maybe wait 12 months. But again, like you said, if we were to tell you guys the things the Canaanites did, not just
I might wait an hour.
Right? Yeah, right.
I'm not going to wait 400 years.
The torture of just human sacrifice. It was so detestable.
Right.
And yet God was slow to anger. And when he did punish them, very rightfully, justly so, he still gave them an opportunity to the last day where Rahab responded like, hey, we've heard of Yahweh and I believe.
Right. And like we mentioned in Ezekiel, where God says he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. Or you go to Genesis chapter 1, that God created man in his own image with dignity and worth, that every person, even the Canaanites, it breaks God's heart to have to execute divine justice because of their unrepentant, rebellious sin. And that's true of God back then, and that's true of God today. God's heart breaks today for people. Yeah. I mean, there are people all around us, and we see it in the news every day. And honestly, it's very easy to get caught up in the sins of the world and get angry and say, God, why don't you do something?
Right.
God, why don't you punish these people? Why don't you deal with this? And we get mad at God because he is slow to anger.
Yeah,
because he is long-suffering.
He's slow in one thing.
So what do you want? You want God to, punish the people you want to punish, but you don't want him to punish people you don't want to punish? Yeah. And again, our sinful heart looks for an excuse to say, God, you're not worth trusting.
Yeah. Well, that's a great application question. So what's a good application question in view of God's wonderful mercy and grace and justice?
Yeah. There are questions that are hard for us, right? Humanly speaking. When I read some things, that God commanded them to go and destroy every, men, women, and children in a village, right? As they go through. We have to recognize that those people are not morally innocent before God, and that God is a God who is gracious and compassionate and just, right? He is faithful. He is true. He's doing what is right. And I have to trust his heart in those situations because I have situations today in my life, right? Situations aren't favorable to me, or I really get the raw end of justice, and there are many things where, God, why don't you execute justice? Yeah. Or God, why do you let that happen to these people over here that I don't know? Right? We have a lot of compassion for people that we have no contact with on the other side of the world.
Right. Yeah.
But again, do I trust God to be God in my life today? And do I run to him or do I run from him?
Right.
So what are the injustices or the questions that you have about God today that cause you to question whether or not he's good and loving? And are you willing to hold on to him even when things don't make sense?
Yeah, will you trust him when obedience looks or feels odd or hard for us?
Yeah. It's, you and I, it doesn't have to be, dealing with life or death with people. It could just be with just circumstances, that are making your life difficult. Is God being unloving toward me? Is he always for me?
That's good. Yeah, will we trust God enough to obey him even if you don't fully understand why, or it's hard for us to swallow? Yeah, and I agree. I think it's a great application question, to trust God and not just trust, I trust God in the Bible, but to trust God in the unknowns where maybe it's not life and death, like you said. Maybe it's just, obeying your boss or honoring your parents or forgiving your neighbor or something that might seem smaller, but it's still hard. And we don't necessarily want to or understand why, but we know it's right. And we're going to trust God enough to obey him. Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Puma. And thank you guys for joining us. Again, just so appreciate you guys joining us on this journey on the Puma Podcast. If you have any questions or thoughts, we'd love to hear them. You can email us at thepumapodcast@gmail.com. And yeah, guys, I pray that with us together, we would just trust God. And even the hard passage of the Bible, we would trust the character and heart of God. We don't necessarily have to understand everything to trust God and everything. And so our hearts is that we together would trust God despite what we might feel or even things we don't understand. And yeah, we'll see you next week, Fridays at 10:10. Till then, guys.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.